I'm very happy that Neil has joined us today. He's a professor of exercise biology in Jyväskylä in Finland. And what he tries to do in his research is basically use AI methods to solve problems in general sports and health domains. His main focus is image processing, but he also examines in more recent work the use of wearables to study human movement and applications of Gen AI in the medical domain. And we met, actually, no, we haven't met in person so far. We always met online, but I've known him now since, I don't know, for 3 or 4 years through a publication that we did together. And I read his work and I was always amazed by it and started adopting it. And in the end, we ended up collaborating. And so I'm very happy that he's here today. And Neil, I guess you can start if you want.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Paul. Actually, I'll talk about that.
Oh, that's good.
Together today. Okay, well, first of all, thanks very much for the invitation. I saw the outline of this course, and I think that the principles you're aiming for are very important ones for young scientists. So I'm happy to be here and to contribute to this. I know that we're kind of pressed for time, so I'm going to try and get through a few key topics today that I wanted to talk about. And I thought I would start from this concept of AI being a black box, because you've probably heard this term before. Whenever people talk about AI, especially in the media, they always say, well, it's a black box, it's too risky, we don't know what's happening inside. And so if we take something like an autonomous vehicle, of course, it's a very, very complex system. So you've got all kinds of sensors, you've got cameras, and a lot of computation going on in the background. And so this is a company called Waymo. These cars are actually on the road. They are completely driverless. So they're already in use. And of course, a lot of people have safety concerns over having a machine on the road that doesn't have any human input. And this argument that it's a black box, which is interesting because actually we're all using black boxes every day. I'm willing to bet most, if not all, of the people here and in your general circles can't explain, for example, how the operating system works on your phone or your laptop. We just use them, we trust them, we work with software every day, most of which is proprietary perhaps, and so we don't actually know what's happening underneath. But this is a reasonable argument for a scientist to make, that if something is completely obscure and we don't know what it's doing, then we need to ask some questions and figure out, is this a reliable, safe tool? Can we reproduce it? This is one of the key words in your program, I think. And the argument can actually be made about a lot of AI applications. They are black boxes. So this is an image I stole from the internet, and it just displays a certain type of neural network, which are one of the kind of key technologies involved in AI. And you might have something like this, that's just a complex web of connections. This is a neural network, and if we train a model like this, we can watch in real time the training process. But if you do that, it's not very interesting, because what you'll see is basically a load of numbers that are just fluctuating as you train the model. You give it more and more examples and you train more iterations, and these numbers will just go up or down, and you won't really be able to say what's happening typically. So this is a legitimate concern. Some tools, some AI tools, still we don't really know what's happening on the inside. But you probably sensed there was a but coming. I'm focusing on image processing today, and that's my main interest of using AI. And with image processing, we have this kind of advantage that actually we can visualize some of what's happening inside the model while it's training. And there's an example here where you start from the left-hand side, you have these very kind of simple patterns that are being detected by a model. So these are actually slightly more complex than they can be, but let's say vertical lines, horizontal lines, very, very simple features. And we can visualize those from inside our model. And what you see is as you go to later stages of the model, so this might be a very big, very complex type of model, what the model learns to do is put together those simpler structures to form more abstract objects or entities or whatever. And I'm not going to show them because I don't have time today, but there's two examples here. One, I think this first link explains very nicely this kind of visualization of what is the model learning, what is it focusing on or looking at, or whatever you want to, whatever expression you want to use. And then there's a demo here where you can basically just run the code. You don't need any kind of AI experience, and you can see it in practice. You can see how these sort of features evolve. So what you would learn from this probably is that the algorithm AI models are looking at the data in a different way to the human brain. This is kind of a recurring theme that will come up in the next half an hour a few times. So AI algorithms don't seem to look at the world in the same way that our brains do. This will become important. And of course, because of this whole black box idea, there are big calls for having methods that we actually can get some kind of understanding from or interpretation from. And the whole subdomain, which is now a very, very big part of AI, is called explainable AI. So the goal is, as you probably guessed, to develop tools that help to not only models that make predictions of some kind, but also to kind of tag onto them tools that can tell us, well, on what basis, what is it that our model is particularly paying attention to? And so what this perhaps complex looking figure is showing is that we have 4 different image examples in the first column. All of the other columns are just different explainable AI methods. And the common feature here is that they give these kind of attention maps. And the color of those maps gives us an idea of how important that particular region was in the algorithm's decision making. So for example, if we had some kind of medical application where we're trying to get an algorithm to make decisions or recommendations or whatever, obviously we want to understand on what basis it's making those decisions. So this kind of attention map can give us a bit more information and tell us what are the key parts of the image that it used to help make that decision or recommendation. So this is an evolving field. What you're seeing here is just one example of a type of method, but there are many of these methods that can be used to kind of explain to an extent what's happening inside the model. Okay, so we come to this concept of reproducibility, which obviously in science is a very important thing. And I deliberately chose a couple of examples that if these tools are not used correctly, then reproducibility may very well not be very good. So the first example I'll give is from ultrasound imaging, which is something I've been working with for many years. And ultrasound is very handy because it's portable. So you can pretty much take it anywhere. I've been on airplanes with ultrasound machines before to take them to other labs. And it's relatively cheap, depending on what you compare it to. And we can image lots of different body parts. So you can see 3 examples here. But it is very user dependent. So what I have actually done this in teaching, but what I usually say is if I give each of you an ultrasound device and a specific task, even if we all examine the same test subject, the same person, we will all come back with different results because of there's so many variables in the way we can use these tools. So we've got a muscle image at the top. We might want to measure fascicle length, which is what this dotted red line indicates, or the thickness of the muscle, various other parameters. Here we've got a muscle tendon junction, so where one of the calf muscles joins the Achilles tendon, and then here we've got a patella tendon. We can measure various things from these, but until fairly recently, we would have done that analysis manually. And that could be a problem for several reasons, which I won't go into too much, but Martina Franke wrote a paper partly about this, summarizing them, I think, very nicely. But the key point really is this subjectivity. So I have one course where I actually ask the students to do this. So I give them some data, ultrasound data. I tell them what variables I want them to compute. And then at the end, we look at the different groups and their results. And typically what we find is, yeah, they show the same kind of trend if they analyze, let's say, a gait cycle, but the absolute values can be quite different. And that's partly because everyone has their own subjective view of how to process these things. And yeah, there's a lot of factors going into this, but it's a problem because there's lots of groups that are doing ultrasound research. And so if we don't standardize things and everyone's just doing things in their own way, using their own subjective judgment to analyze the data, right, then it makes it very hard for us to figure out what is actually correct, what is true, versus what is just kind of measurement error. And so this was one of the motivations behind the work that Paul mentioned at the beginning. So this is an AI approach to analyzing muscle architecture from ultrasound images, but it also displays quite nicely in one slide, hopefully, the supervised learning process. So supervised learning is a very common approach of doing AI or training AI models. And basically it works as you may be able to guess from the name. So top left, we have an image, and bottom left, we have a corresponding label. And basically that label, it's got a load of lines on it, and those lines represent muscle fascicles. It's bundles of muscle fibers from this image. And I've labeled that myself. And basically this is my way of telling my model, this is what I want you to focus on. This is what I want you to learn. These white lines represent the things that I'm interested in. So I've got an image label pair, and I'm going to put that into my model. And the training process basically is an AI algorithm trying to figure out what is the mapping between this image and this label, so that in future, if I ask it to label a new image, it will be able to hopefully do that quite well. One image label pair, unfortunately, isn't enough. If it was, my life would have been considerably easier over the past few years. I think we had something like 900 images maybe for this model, which means for each of these images, I had to then manually label them all. And if you think that sounds really painful and boring, you'd be absolutely right. That is exactly what it is. But when you train the model, if it has worked, if it has learned this kind of logic that you're hoping, you might see something like this. So this is actually the result of two models working. So the blue lines, that's one model that's designed to train just to look for muscle boundaries or aponeurosis. And the red lines are muscle fascicles that my fascicle model has learned to detect. And if I tell you that I did a three-year PhD, probably 2.5 years of that was just processing these images manually. So clicking on each structure, going to the next frame, clicking again. This is a very painful process. And so you can imagine I was rather happy when I got this model working, because this fully automates the process. So it's kind of, if you like, removing human subjectivity from every frame of analysis. And I've got some kind of hopefully reproducible logic that my algorithm can then apply, not just to my data in future, but to anybody's data. So wherever that group happens to be in the world, if we're all using the same tool, then we have this reproducible logic that's kind of treating the data in the same way. And this is just kind of a behind the scenes look at what you just saw in that video. So as I said, two models. One is looking for the muscle boundaries. The other one's looking for the muscle fascicles. And you can see that it returns, in some cases, only what we're interested in. In other cases, it returns a lot more information. We can obviously then filter out what we're interested in. And then the final column here is, this is what you get as the output. So you get some kind of concrete numbers telling you about the architecture in that image. Okay, so this is another example, the exact same model. All it does is show you different movements. And what you'll see is the model doesn't work as well necessarily for different types of movements. So here you've got a nice slow passive rotation. So our model works pretty well, finds lots and lots of fascicles in this case, and it finds the muscle boundaries pretty well as well. But then as we go later in the video, the maximal contraction, so you get nothing happening, and then you get a very fast length change, but still pretty good performance. And then we go to the real challenge case, which is walking, and we find performance drops because, okay, the image quality here is not brilliant. I'll come back to that. But also it finds less information because the muscle is moving much more quickly. And this kind of makes sense. But the same logic is being applied in all of those cases. It's one trained model. Okay, now, if you read in the media about AI, what they'll basically tell you is it's magic, it's brilliant, it's perfect, doesn't make mistakes, and it will fix all of the problems in your life. That is unfortunately not true, not now, and probably not in 50 years either. So here's an example of where, a point I already made, where human logic does not really match the logic that the computer is using. So what's happening here is this video is playing, the frame is changing, and the algorithm's detecting different fascicles in different regions, and yet to our eyes, nothing's really happening. As the video goes on, you start to see a contraction happening, but at the beginning, if I were manually labeling this for the first 50 frames or so, I wouldn't really be seeing any difference. I would just find fascicles in the exact same location. But the algorithm is seeing something different. And again, this makes sense because we see this composite image when we look at this data. What the algorithm sees is just numbers. It sees pixel values arranged in some sequence. So whatever logic it's using, it's not the same as the way the human brain interprets this. So this is important because it means we shouldn't expect it to reproduce exactly what we want necessarily, but it's also going to make some kind of obvious and silly mistakes. And the way I usually put it is to say that the kind of mistakes it makes sometimes are mistakes that no human would make. And here's an example. So this image, these actually two images top left, those are generated by generative AI application. So it thinks it's generated some nice pictures of people, which it kind of has, but if you look at the details, you'll understand that those are not legitimate images. Human would never accept this kind of output, but the algorithm doesn't know because it doesn't understand the world in the same way that we do. And there's a million ways we can make this point, and I have some very big words on this slide, but basically our approaches don't show consciousness in the way, whatever that means in a human, we don't understand it well enough, but we certainly can't replicate it yet, at least in a computer. So we should expect differences between the human interpretation and the algorithm, at least sometimes. And so my vision of the future is not so much it's either AI takes over the world and humans die out, or humans win and defeat AI. I think that doesn't make sense. What we should be looking for is the synergy between human intelligence and computer intelligence, if we can call it that. Because computers are very good at some things, superior at some things, but then again, humans are superior to computers at some things. So what we should look for is the common ground and where we can exploit those two things efficiently. Okay, so this is another example. Different kind of approach now, going from medical imaging to imaging people. This is a pose estimation algorithm. This one's called Open Pose, but there are many of them out there. And this is from a project where we were basically looking at how well can we recreate these kind of tests, these basic clinical physiotherapy tests, in a remote setting. So for example, during COVID, we had lockdown, people didn't have access to care, and can we do some of these things remotely so that the patient doesn't always have to come to a clinic or to a hospital? And this works pretty well for what we're doing because we deliberately chose quite simple tests. Is it reproducible? Well, in our project, the short answer to that question is yes. We've tested test retest. We've also tested lab versus home when the people do this test independently. But this is the kind of approach now, pose estimation, being used a lot in the field of biomechanics. And we want to know that we can actually get kind of valid data out of this, because whether, in fact, if people were to come out now and publish results suggesting these approaches are rubbish, it would kind of already be too late because we have 5 years of publications already using them. So what we've done as part of a follow-up to that work is implement this in a mobile app, working with our local hospital. And we wanted to make a user-friendly app that people can actually use either when they visit the hospital or in their own homes. Now you're going to get a bit of a Finnish language lesson because the app is only implemented in Finnish at the moment. So They choose a test, they get an instruction video. This is not it, this is just a placeholder. But then they get instructions out loud once the test starts. So you obviously all understand Finnish fluently, but I'll tell you anyway. It said that you first go to the center of the image and sit down. Our algorithm checks that the person's visible within the image. Raise your hand when you're ready. So that just gives the person time to get comfortable, and they can start whenever they like. And in this case, we're doing the sit to stand test. So it simply counts the reps as you perform them. We time the test, of course. And then once the test is finished, we display some feedback on the screen. And we can customize this, of course, what we tell them immediately. And then the data gets stored on our server, actually. And then we can process the data and do what we want with it. But how do we make something like this reproducible? Well, there are a few steps. One you already saw, which is you must check that the person is visible before you do the test, because this is done online in real time. If you discover after the test is done that actually their head wasn't visible or their arms are out of the image, well, it's too late to call them back, perhaps. So we check that beforehand, but also the way you instruct them, of course, is important. So in that test, which I would argue, so I was the test subject, I would argue that wasn't the fastest I could have done that particular test. But if you instruct people to just do 5 repetitions, they might just do it at their own pace, in which case you're not testing the same thing as maximal capacity. This is one example, of course, but you need to consider these things. How is this person going to use this tool in their own home without any supervision? Because you might, or we might think as scientists, it's very straightforward. You press a few buttons, but for the user, if there's any kind of hesitation or doubt, then the quality of the data isn't going to be what we want. And as I said, we work with the hospital on this, and they're very, very strict on what you can and can't do. And what we had to agree was we'll actually process the data online. So what we're doing is just detecting these key body points, saving the XY coordinates, so we know exactly where those points are in the image. But then we discard the video. And that was how the hospital agreed to let us do this. But of course, that's dangerous, because then we don't have the original data anymore. So if we find out later on that there's some strange results, well, we can't then go back to the raw data and figure out why are they strange. So we will implement in the future the opportunity to keep this data, but this is a very big factor, of course, because we will, in my view, always need human oversight to monitor, ensure the quality of our data is good enough. Okay, so I thought for this sort of second half, I'll go through a few key things that I think you need to include if you're working with AI models in general. So first of all, you tend to need a lot of data. There are shortcuts to this, but ultimately transfer learning is one example, but it piggybacks on an existing pre-trained model. So there was still a need for a lot of data in the beginning. There are allegedly 7 V's of big data. Yeah, maybe, but for me, the main focus is on the volume, so how much data, and the variety. If you only have a very narrow data set, your model will only learn to do a very narrow task. It's not magic, it's just mathematics done on a large scale. So this stage, collecting your data set, is massively important for training AI models. Generative AI is an example. You've all used ChatGPT, which is essentially trained on the entire internet. So we should expect it, at least sometimes, to be impressive because it's seen so much data. Unfortunately, as researchers, we don't often have access to that kind of volume of data. Then also the quality is important. So Paul, don't worry, these are not your images. I took these from the internet somewhere. So on the left here, we've got a nice example of a cross-sectional image of a muscle. And what you can see if you look closely is you have this kind of white border that outlines the muscle. And we could label that fairly easily and then calculate the cross-sectional area in that muscle. On the right, we've got a little bit more of a tricky one. And so here within the red circles, you can see that you can't really clearly see where the boundary is. So it might kind of Hopefully you can see my drawing. It might kind of go like that, but then again, maybe it goes more like that. Maybe it goes a bit wider like that. And equally on the other side, if I asked all of you to do this task, probably you come up with some different interpretations. So again, that could be very important. If you're calculating the area of this muscle within this region here, where you put the borders is crucially important. That's one thing. But another thing is that if we want to automate this task with an AI model, well, if you, the human, have difficulty labeling this image, you should not expect an algorithm to magically be able to do it, because AI will only learn what we train it on. So we have to be very careful when we're collecting the data already, and shouldn't just naively expect, well, it doesn't matter about data quality. I'll just have an AI model that will solve all my problems. Unfortunately not. Okay. And then same thing, different example. So 2 images of muscles. You probably don't need me to tell you that the one on the left is hideous and awful. The one on the right is nice and clear. So muscle boundaries, we can very clearly delineate in the image on the right. And then we've got these nice striated portions of the muscle. So we can, our deep learning method would probably do very well analyzing this. Whereas the one on the left, well, yeah, okay, muscle border maybe is okay, even though it's very grainy. But the muscle fascicles, it's very, very difficult to say. So if we put data of this kind of quality on the left into our model, it is going to struggle to make good predictions. And equally, if you want to apply the trained model later to your data, and your data look more like this, don't be too surprised if the model just doesn't work. And I get inquiries like this quite often. Why doesn't the model work? Okay, send me your images. Yeah, if they look something like this, we're just not going to be able to train a model that can work with poor quality data, unfortunately. Okay, so there you go. Garbage in, garbage out. You've all heard it. And this has to be obviously resolved before you start working with and building upon your models. Okay, and then the labeling process. So I talked about supervised learning. So you can imagine then that if you don't get this labeling part right, you will not end up with good quality working models. This image of the guy with the dumbbell in the top right, this is a real image from an open source data set. I've forgotten which one, but I wrote a paper about it a few years ago, so you can find the details. But what happens is you have organizations that curate these massive data sets, and they'll crowdsource the labeling process. So if you've got like ImageNet, for example, I think it's got something like 15 million images. You're not going to label those yourself. So you crowdsource the process, maybe you pay people, and they'll each label a certain number of images. And this is an example. So these red dots are actually labels that have been supplied by somebody. And just to give you a couple of quick examples, if you look at the left shoulder, it's kind of right on the front of the shoulder. The right shoulder marker is actually in his armpit, which is not the same anatomical region. If you look at the hip, I don't know why there's 3 markers. I still don't know what the middle one is, but the 2 outer hip markers, if any of you have ever used motion analysis, you'll know that the greater trochanter head is nowhere near where these 2 markers are placed, and so on. So if you label the data using non-experts who they don't have any anatomical knowledge, you're feeding those labels into your model. So your model is going to learn what we would call faulty logic. And if you look at, pointer back, if you focus on the left image here, if you watch the hips in particular, what you'll notice is the hip markers that our open pose algorithm is labeling, they don't quite move in sync with the actual hip mark or the hip of the participant. And this makes perfect sense. If we have inconsistent logic in our labeling, then our model is going to get confused. It's going to have some difficulties to accurately label those body parts. So again, this all comes down to at the training stage, when you're curating your data set, you have to get these fundamental things right, or you will not end up with an accurate, well-performing model. Okay, just briefly on this is a commercial solution, but they found a good response to that problem, which is that the head of the company is a basically former biomechanist. So he collated his own data set, and came up with his own way of labeling the data, which we don't know the details of because it's proprietary. But as you can see from these examples, at least, potentially you're going to get an improved output and improved model performance because you are optimizing this data labeling process earlier. Okay, I'll skip ahead to open science because I wanted to finish with this for the last sort of 5 or 10 minutes. So you are all, hopefully all of you, fortunate enough to be, or you are fortunate enough to live now. I'm just about old enough to have done a bachelor's thesis where you had to go to the library and actually take the paper copies of the journals off the shelf and take photocopies of them if you wanted to read the paper. That's how old I am. And so now, of course, we've advanced and you can get basically anything at the click of a button. But open science is critically important, and it's something that I've been a big advocate of for many years, because it doesn't matter how much of a genius you are, if nobody ever reads anything you've written, then your impact will be limited, if anything. And of course, this differs quite a lot between what we do in academia and what companies do, which again, it's not a judgment, they have to make money somehow. But we have in academia what I consider to be a very positive advance, especially in the last 5 or 10 years, in terms of software, but also other things like code sharing, data sharing even. This is one of my favorite examples, Hugging Face. For those who are not familiar, you can go to this website and basically find a model on just about anything related to AI, any kind of subdomain of AI. And very often you can actually run demos within that. So you don't need to have any advanced knowledge of AI. You can actually play with these models sometimes, and you can import your data and see how well the approaches work. This is a tremendous advance that even 10, 15 years ago, we couldn't even dream of something like this. And then GitHub obviously is another where myself and Paul and many others have shared the work that we've been doing over the past few years. This is a foundational model, so-called, because it's been trained on a massive data set, but also that you can use this, you can piggyback off this and train your own models. So this one's for object detection, and it's by Meta. And sometimes people think, well, why would Meta be working in a space like this? Well, because they have access to a huge amount of data, which many of you have very kindly uploaded and sometimes even labeled on Facebook's behalf. So when it asks you, if you upload an image, who's in this image, and it draws a square around the head of the person, when you tell them the name of the person, you're helping to label their data and helping them to come up with these fancy models. So well done, you. You've contributed to open science in your own way. But as you can see, 11 million images, over 1 billion labels. As scientists, we can't realistically do this kind of thing. So it makes sense for us to piggyback off of this work and then apply it to our own problems. Okay, so I mentioned data sharing as well, and this is a lot more tricky. So in the EU, we have GDPR, which is generally a very good thing because it prevents people from just sharing our personal anonymized data freely, and that's important. But on the other hand, we need to find a balance, because if we can share data, potentially we can solve some big important problems more efficiently and more quickly. So I used to take a lot of pleasure from showing this sequence of images, because 2 or 3 years ago I would ask the audience, what is the one factor that's true of all of these images? Nobody ever correctly guessed. Nowadays they always correctly guess. Of course, the answer is they're all fake. These people don't exist. These are all completely synthetic faces. So the model has just seen thousands and thousands of images of faces, and then we ask it to reproduce using that logic that it's learned. And you can see it does a pretty good job. We can go further now, not just isolated images, we can produce video sequences completely using generative AI. So you're familiar with ChatGPT, which produces text in response to a prompt. We can produce all kinds of data. I'll skip over this one. I was going to explain the logic, but I like showing this one because it's a really nice example of generative AI. So this is me speaking English. It's very quiet, but you've already got the live demo, so I don't need to play that. The point here is the other two are the exact same video, with a slight tweak. So probably some of you understand French a lot better than me, but the point there is that it's translating my voice, of course, into another language, but it's also preserving the tone quite well. And if you watch the mouth movements, it actually looks like it synchronizes the mouth movements with the spoken language. I'll give you one last example. So just for clarification, I don't really speak French, maybe a few words, and I certainly don't speak Japanese, but through a generative AI algorithm in a few seconds, I can pretend that I do pretty well. Okay, why is he talking about speaking different languages? Who cares? Well, the key point is these are AI tools and they don't care about what kind of data you give them. What they do is they work with data sets where there's some kind of pattern. If you give them enough data, they can solve problems at scale. So we can generate data of all kinds, not just images, videos, time series data, text, of course, like ChatGPT. And this has many advantages, which I won't go into, but the key one in relation to this point is it may allow us a mechanism of sharing data. If we can't share sensitive data, well, what about synthetic data? Because it technically doesn't belong to anybody, doesn't contain any metadata, it cannot be traced back to any individual. And this could then facilitate the sharing of data sets across borders, allowing us to scale up our data sets and maybe train better predictive models. Just a quick note on regulation, because I think there's a lot of very big ethical questions around this, and we can discuss this after my talk in a moment. But this is how development happens in cartoon form. Somebody somewhere smart comes up with a new method, and then weeks later, months, or even years later, the regulators have to try and figure out, well, how do we kind of put guardrails on this? And we're seeing this with generative AI now. How do we stop things like copyright infringement? How do we stop people making synthetic stories up about real people that affect their lives? And we're kind of in the middle of that now, and we don't really have answers. And these are some recent court cases. And again, you can see all the big players are there, Meta, Google, because they have access to massive data sets and they've trained models, often including data from the likes of you or I, but without us necessarily knowing what data is being used, how is it being used, and so on. There's a lot of gray areas here. But as a kind of final takeaway, and again, people in industry are welcome to disagree with me, and I understand why, but as a scientist, for me, open science is a massively important development that has probably benefited many of you. It's certainly benefited me, but ultimately, as a field, I think that we can all benefit. We can all kind of stand on the shoulders of giants by learning from what they've done, piggybacking off of their tools, and hopefully come up with something better and allowing us to solve some of these big problems that remain in our field. So thank you for your time, for your attention. I'm happy to discuss and answer any questions or comments that come up.